Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, and welcome to the museum. I say as if I've spent any time at the museum before today. We are going to talk, we're going to start with a little bit of focus on Trump's plan, and then we'll get a little more theoretical, and we'd like to leave some time for questions at the end. Former teacher, I like to tell everyone the agenda before we get started. So before I dive into questions, I wanted to just say a quick word. You're hearing preschool and childcare interchangeably a lot today, and I know that a lot of people in this room are familiar with the difference, but I just wanted to go over really quickly. Preschool is usually intended to talk about 3 and 4-year-olds, and usually with more of an academic focus. Childcare applies to anybody, from the time they're born. Really up, in terms of the federal definition, it applies up to age 12 for the most part. So we're going to be talking today when we talk about childcare, because Trump has framed his plan, President Trump has framed his plan in terms of childcare. We're really talking about childcare for children 5 and younger for the most part. And we're not talking as much about preschool, though it should be noted that preschool doubles as childcare for a lot of families, because you can't have a 3-year-old latchkey kid, right? So if you have a preschool program, that needs to work as childcare as well. So lots of confusion about that. So diving into this, we've got 65% of American children have all available parents, as it's said in the literature, all available parents working. So that means any resident parents that they're living with are working. 65% of American children. So that's a lot of kids that need some form of care during the day. And it's been theorized that that's one of the reasons that Trump brought this up this fall. It's sort of an unusual move for a conservative in the campaign. That hasn't happened very much in the last couple decades. So you've heard the plan described. I'm not going to describe it again, but I'm going to jump right in with Elaine, who is here with the Tax Policy Institute, and say, so Trump's childcare plan was proposed, one of his most detailed proposals of the campaign. He's given Ivanka a lot of credit for it. And the plan would provide a tax deduction, as we talked about, for care expenses. Can you tell us a little bit about who specifically would benefit from this plan?
So the plan sort of has 3 prongs. There's a savings account, there's a deduction that's pretty large, and there's a pretty small tax credit. And the way all these things combine together is that the first 2 of those pieces really benefit higher income families, and then the credit will benefit lower income families. So at the Tax Policy Center, we're estimating it's a $115 billion program. That's a 10-year estimate. And most of those benefits will go to families with at least $100,000. And in fact, a quarter of those benefits are going to go to families with at least $200,000. And we would argue that these are conservative estimates, because that's really the deduction plus the credit. And the savings account will further benefit higher income families more than low income families.
So just to put some numbers to that, if I understand this correctly, if you're in, say, the 33% tax bracket, which would mean you're making $200,000 to $400,000, and the average cost of care in your state is, say, $10,000, you would get 33% of $10,000 would be your savings, basically. Is that correct?
Exactly. So when we give people a deduction, what we're basically saying is, here's some money that you earned this year, and you don't have to pay taxes on it. And if you're high income, you might pay a tax rate of 33%, 39%, something pretty large. So that's a big benefit for you. If you're a low income family, you might owe no federal income taxes because you don't make enough money to have to pay taxes, so the benefit's worth nothing if it's a deduction. And if you're paying taxes at a 10 or 15% rate, then avoiding tax on that money is worth only 10 or 15% of that total dollar.
So I just did some quick math, because I'm like hands-on, right? I want to know exactly how this would work for a specific family. So if you were in that 33% tax bracket, and I looked up Oregon because I'm from Oregon, the average cost of care for an infant is $11,000, you'd save $3,600. If you were earning less, if you were earning $38,000 to $92,000, you'd only save $2,700 in the same state. So it's like really like the families who are making less are also saving less in this plan.
Right, it's very upside down, the benefit. You can think of high income families getting pretty large subsidies and low income families getting almost nothing from the deduction.
And that said, and there's also some tax credits and some other things sort of for the bottom end, right?
Right, and to put it in perspective, the tax credit is lower income limits, and you either get your payroll taxes, which is 7.65%, or half of the lower earners' payroll taxes. So what this means is if your credit might be only 4%, which is not probably going to move you to buy either better childcare or more childcare, and it could be nothing. And that's if you're in a married couple and one person works and one person stays at home, then the tax credit is worth nothing to you. because that lower earner owes no payroll taxes. And that's very different from the deduction in which candidate Trump spelled out that if you're a married couple and one person works and one person stays at home, you are eligible to get the deduction. And so even if you don't have childcare expenses, in fact, you can get the deduction, which is very different. So we're willing to subsidize high-income parents who stay at home and not low-income parents who stay at home.
Okay. And just last question on that, the details are, how much would that plan cost by your estimate?
So Tax Policy Center estimates that the childcare piece of it is $115 billion over 10 years. There's also an elder care piece that was sort of rolled out at the same, and that adds another $17 billion to the cost. And that's kind of big dollars in the childcare world. It's very small dollars in the tax world, but kind of a big deal for childcare.
It is. Okay, and so Katharine, going to you, this is a bit of a left turn for the Republican Party as a whole. I mean, we haven't seen this, especially in a campaign, a presentation like this. How are conservatives on the Hill reacting to this idea?
I don't know why we would necessarily call this a left turn for several reasons. One, I think that it's becoming increasingly clear to everybody that what's happening to very young children is important to our society. What we know is that the first 5 years of life are the most important developmental period of life, and the first 3 years in particular. So we really have a much clearer understanding of that than we did. So I think that once people understand that, it's really a bipartisan concern that infants and toddlers, for example, are in high-quality environments during the day. So that's the first reason I would say I'm not sure it's a left turn. The second reason I would say I'm not sure it's a left turn is that, I don't think the mortgage tax deduction is seen as a left-wing program, right?
Sure.
If you own a house, you're able to write off the mortgage tax, deduct that from your taxes, exactly as Elaine was explaining. You're going to save depending on whether you own a house, obviously, and whether you have a mortgage, and you're going to save $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever it is. So I would really compare this plan to the mortgage tax deduction in terms of the amount of money that's involved for people and who it's most likely to impact.
Okay. That said, it is an expensive plan. And it would give a subsidy of some sort to families through the tax code. Do you think it's likely to gain support among Republican lawmakers who have a majority in Congress right now?
My impression is that there is, as I said, I would actually call it transpartisan concern about the well-being of young children in our society. And there's also a concern about a $20 trillion debt. The Urban Institute did a recent project on looking at expenditures on kids now and going forward. 10 years out, the four biggest line items on our budget are going to be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt, according to the study that they've done. So, the debt is getting bigger, not smaller. The amount of money that we're going to have to be spending on new things is either, depending on how you look at it, either already non-existent or it's certainly not going to be growing a lot. So I don't think that conservatives on the Hill are really eager to be spending public tax dollars on programs that help people who, everybody wants more money than they have, but people who already have the ability to make sure that their kids are in good places during the day when they're little. They may have to make sacrifices, but for sacrifices for people making $100,000 a year, that means, you don't get a new car as often, you don't go out to dinner as much. Those tend to be the kinds of sacrifice. You don't live in exactly the neighborhood you'd like. Those are the sacrifices you're making. You're not making a sacrifice of putting your child somewhere that's actually dangerous or unhealthy. It's not that level of sacrifice.
Okay, and we'll come back to you. I know you have some alternative ideas as well about how this might happen. But Carmel, CAP, your organization proposed, as well, and actually Clinton proposed something very similar during the campaign, but proposed a new way of paying for childcare using tax credits, I believe. Can you explain that proposal a little bit?
Well, Secretary Clinton's proposal was that no family would pay more than 10% of their income for childcare. So, as Elaine was saying, the President Trump's proposal is upside down in our view. Secretary Clinton's was right side up because the majority of the support would go to people in low and middle income families. The Center for American Progress has a proposal that was similar. Ours was based on a tax credit. I would say there's lots of things that were different about our proposal than the one that President Trump has put out, including that it was progressive, not regressive. We also had ties to quality standards and investments in the workforce. I think we know we need to tackle the affordability issue in childcare. For some families, they have to spend up to 36% of their income on childcare. That's just not tenable. For many of those families, it means children are in programs that are not of high quality. For many families, it means one of the parents has to step out of the workforce. When they do that, the loss to that, we did a report that showed loss in terms of retirement savings and their earnings trajectory meant that really cost them 4 times their annual salary to do that. So we know we need to solve the affordability issue, but we also know that we need to solve a supply and quality issue. We did a report recently in 8 states that showed that as many as half of the children in those 8 states were in what we termed childcare deserts. There just weren't programs for them to attend. And then we also know that another study showed that only 10% of programs were considered of the highest quality. So we've got to tackle all those problems. I would just go back to what Elaine was saying about President Trump's proposal. It's great that he's giving lip service to the need to help families afford childcare, but his proposal, like so many of his proposals, are a little bit of smoke and mirrors because it's really just a disguised tax cut to wealthier families. The savings portion that Elaine alluded to would allow people like Ivanka Trump to sock away $2,000 a year, even before they're pregnant or thinking of having children. So that's a great tool for people who are on the upper end of the income strata, and they could sock away $2,000 a year and then use that money, have tax benefit, and that would be tax benefited funding, and they would be able to use it for things like private tutors and nannies and private schools. So that's a great expenditure for people at the high end of the income scale, but really his proposal does virtually nothing for those at the lower end of the income scale and really very little for middle income families. I should defer to the tax expert for quantifying these things, but one analysis of his proposal shows that for every $100 spent under his proposal, $40 would go to people on the higher end of the income scale, only $10 to $15 for middle income families. So, and that's really not where the problem is on the higher end of the income scale, where we see families struggling and having to make choices, not, as Katharine said, about whether to go to the movies or go to dinner, but about whether to stay in their jobs, whether to be able to put food on their table. Those are the families that really need our help.
Okay. So given that conservatives on the Hill are maybe not that excited about this plan for the reasons that they're not, and that we don't have a Democratic majority and the chance of a plan like yours going through right now is probably iffy. Given those 2 realities, and then also the reality that when you survey the American people, you've got 82% of Republicans saying that they think childcare should be more affordable, 98% of Democrats saying they think childcare should be more affordable, and then several of the states, as has been mentioned earlier, several of the states who have the broadest childcare plans, childcare/preschool plans, are actually very conservative states. Georgia and Oklahoma leap to mind as places that spend a lot of money on this. Given that there's this sort of, it feels like a unification on this issue in the population and then also among state leaders and to some extent among city leaders, why is this so contentious in Washington, and why is this not like the one thing it seems like we should be able to find consensus on if everybody is saying, yes, we agree it should be more affordable?
Well, I guess I wouldn't give up on the possibility that we can't do that. I mean, I think the fact that President Trump is talking about it, the fact that there is bipartisan support for investments in childcare means that it should be an area where we can make progress. But I think we need to make progress where progress is needed. So we need to convince conservatives on the Hill that if funding is going to be spent on this, that it needs to be spent on the people who need it the most.
Okay.
And I agree. It's extremely important when a leader is saying, this is an issue and we're going to try to solve it. And one of the great things about our process is that, you know, there's a plan that comes out in the campaign, and then there's actual legislation that gets written. And it gets written by people who, you know a lot of these details. There's a lot of organizations that are trying to provide information. And so there's always the possibility that we could change this entirely. We could flip it upside down in the legislative process and say, these are the families that are struggling the most, and here's the most efficient way to do it. And you might, come up with something that's a well-designed spending program that fits with a tax program. So you could imagine those dollars, instead of going to high-income families, being put into these child development block grant funds and being direct spending programs that are best suited to serve low-income families. They're delivered monthly when your child care bill comes. They can fluctuate over time. And then you save the benefits for middle-income families for the tax code and just make them much smaller. Tax benefits are always ill-suited to help very low-income families because we deliver tax benefits at the end of the year when we file our tax returns, but childcare expenses happen all through the year.
So I guess I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think we need to be, clear about when we're talking middle income, what exactly do economics of families look like?
Yeah.
So 40% of children under 6 in this country live in families earning under $50,000 a year. 40%. Those aren't poor people. That's a big chunk of the middle class. So on a family of 4 making $50,000 a year, we're talking, just imagine, a mother, a father, an infant, and a 3-year-old. Their take home is about $3,500 a month after taxes. So that's 40% of the children under 6 in this country live in families making less than that. So you figure $800 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment. You figure a few $100s a month for food, utilities. Let's say one takes the bus to work, one there's a car payment. You're starting with $3,500. There is nothing left for childcare. You're not paying anything for childcare. So a tax benefit for childcare is not going to help you because you can't pay for it in the first place. That's a little bit like a mortgage tax deduction that's going to give you $3,000 a year when you have zero money to buy a house, right? That does not help you. So in addition, we don't have an endless amount of money. We just don't, unfortunately. So we're going to have to prioritize I want to say the least advantaged kids, but actually what I'm talking about here is 40% of the children under 6. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm in Washington, we're in Washington. Washington's convenient because it's just this one giant chunk of money all in one place, right? That's why we're all here. However, the fact is that the states we're spending $700 billion a year on K-12 across the country, and states and localities carry about 90% of that. The federal support of K-12 public education is about 10%. The reason for that is historically in the United States, the education of children is considered a state responsibility. When you look at the total federal dollars spent on just say, care and education birth to 18, which is child care and pre-K for kids under 5, and then K through 12. On the federal level, 72% of the total dollars spent are spent on K-12, and 28% are spent on early childhood. On the state level, 98% of the total dollars birth to 18 are spent on K-12, 2% on early childhood. So those are two things we need to keep in mind. Number one, we've got to keep in mind that 40% of the people in this country have family economics that bear very little resemblance to probably most of the people in this room, and we forget that. Thing one. Thing two, we're in Washington, and we forget that there are 50 states out there who have the primary responsibility for the well-being of their populations, and that has to be a part of this picture.
We're going to go, I have one more question, but we're going to go to questions before we go back to my questions because I've asked a lot. So raise your hand if you have a question. I know there's someone right over here.
My name is Michelle Edwards, and I'm here with my organization, Live It, Learn It, but as a former teen mom who really benefited from childcare, I have a 27-year-old child now who's a college graduate. I wonder how you guys are thinking about teenage moms who really don't even understand all of the economics and the tax benefits, but really need high-quality childcare.
Great, and that gets to some extent to Head Start, because I know Head Start is one of the organizations that provides a lot of care for teen moms in particular. Anyone want to take that?
Well, I guess I would say that's, for those teen moms, it's even more important to ensure that any assistance that's being given out prioritizes those who at the lower end of the income scale and provides them with real benefits, which means benefits that don't come to them at the end of the year and that can really cover the cost of high quality care. I don't disagree with Elaine that it could be more effective to deliver assistance to lower income folks through a direct spending program, but I do reject the idea that you can't provide assistance to those at that end of the income scale through a tax system. I don't want those folks to be left out if the tax vehicle is the vehicle for Congress. Under our proposal, we structured it similar to the Affordable Care Act, where the benefits would be given out in real time directly to the provider of childcare. That's more complicated, probably drives tax specialists crazy because it's getting a little creative, but I think it's important to recognize that it is doable. We're doing it right now with another program that I would argue is working. And so I think that, I think from where the Center for American Progress sits, we're almost agnostic about whether you deliver it through the tax system or you deliver it through a direct spending program, as long as whatever program you're standing up really prioritizes the people who need the help the most, which I would say is first and foremost those at the low income spectrum, but also middle income families that Katharine's describing.
And I think your question makes clear too that this conversation is about ways to make childcare more affordable broadly. It's not about expanding existing programs like Head Start that have been the primary vehicle for serving families at the lowest end of the income bracket. Anything else quick on that before we take another question?
I just want to make the point that Head Start, in many cases, it combines with childcare, but the Head Start itself, it is not sufficient to support working families because the hours are much more limited. It's usually, it's not 52 weeks a year. Exactly. It's usually just a few hours a day. So it has to be supplemented with childcare. Where from the point of view of a 2-year-old, a 2-year-old does not care what we call that funding stream, whether we're saying it's academic or care. They don't care. They are learning every minute, no matter what we call it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more relevant program for teen moms would be CCDBG, which is an existing subsidy program for childcare, which is a very important program, but many eligible families, there isn't enough funding in it for all of those who could benefit from it. Right. And also many states, because it's so state-driven, the amount of the subsidy isn't sufficient for high quality care. So
well, and there's such a wide variety of what Head Start is, right? Because it's run by local agencies, so it can be anything from run by a school district with certified teachers to like run by a small nonprofit with like, so people who are not certified teachers. Let's take another question before we run out of time. In the back there.
Okay, thanks. Hi, my name is Chris Swanson with Johns Hopkins University, and we've been talking about funding for access, which is really important, but I also don't want to lose the the parts of Secretary Clinton's plan for the workforce transformation. So I would love any thoughts on how do we help to fund workforce development, particularly when many of the workers in childcare come from the same communities that we're talking about having to fund for access. So.
Right. That's a good question. Elaine, was there, if I've missed anything, was there nothing in there, there was nothing in this plan, on the tax credit plan that Trump proposed that would go to workforce issues, is there?
That's right. These were all straight childcare proposals, deductions for costs and credits. I did want to point out that, of course, you're correct that the tax system is really good for low-income families and that it delivers the largest anti-poverty program, the Earned Income Tax Credit, in the United States. And so it's not that the tax system can't do anything, but I do think we have to be sensitive to the limitations of the tax system. You know, can the IRS deliver a credit that is, you know, dependent on the quality of the institution? Can it deliver things effectively on a month-to-month basis? You know, the Affordable Care Act, there's some hold harmless provisions. Are we willing to do that for childcare too? If someone has an income bump and at the end of the year they're not eligible for the childcare credit, are we willing to let those dollars that were already spent stay in the pockets, or are we going to grab them back? These are important questions when you're thinking about designing a tax program that largely is an annual resolution process.
So real quick, we've got 1 minute left. I'm just going to go to everybody really quick. Do you think that it is possible in the next, we'll say 2 years, to find a compromise that would help childcare be more affordable for a majority of Americans?
You know, I think that the time horizon for any real kind of new way of thinking about things is going to be more than 2 years.
Okay.
I think it's likely that in the next couple of years there will be some kind of small step, additional step in the direction of something that people are increasingly recognize as so important.
Okay.
And my hope is that we are focused on 40% of children who are in families under 50,000. That would be what would make the most sense to me.
Okay, what do you think next 2 years? What can
I'm
happen?
an optimist. I think that we can do great things, and the fact that we're all talking about it is a step forward. Where I'm a pessimist, though, is that tax reform is really hard. It took Ronald Reagan to do it. So I don't see big tax reform happening, but I do imagine that if something happens on the tax side, that a small piece will be fit in for childcare, and it's our job to sort of make sure it's targeted properly.
Okay, Carmel?
So as a policy wonk, I'm hopeful as well. As someone who's worked in politics for a long time, I'm skeptical just because if you look at the daily news around the Republicans' focus so far on trying to do something with the Affordable Care Act, it doesn't seem like they're really kind of have their act together, and I think it's hard to imagine that they will accomplish a lot in this session of Congress.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you. That's all our time for today.